Merriam-Webster defines awe as an emotion variously combining dread, veneration, and wonder that's inspired by authority or by the sacred or sublime. The word awe comes from root words meaning fear as well as reverence, and aw's etymological children include both the words awful and awesome. In the word awful, being full of awe has taken on the fear and dread portions of awe, whereas in the word awesome, being full of awe has taken on the reverence and wonder portions. But awful and awesome come from the same root. Human beings similarly encompass both aspects of awe. We are awesome and awful in equal measure. In an essay on human resilience and imagination's transformative power, author Susan Griffin tells a story about the French surrealist poet Robert Desnos. The story was first told to her by her friend Odette, who's also a writer, and Odette is a Holocaust survivor. Desnos was part of the French resistance to the Nazi occupation, and he was captured in his resistance and sent to a concentration camp. While he was there, Griffin writes, along with many others who crowded in the bed of a large truck, Desnos is being taken away from the barracks of the concentration camp. Leaving, the mood is somber. Everyone on the truck knows that the truck is headed for the gas chambers. And when it arrives, no one can speak at all. Even the guards fall silent. But the silence is soon interrupted by an energetic man who jumps out of line and grabs another person who's standing there. That man, Robert Desnos, reads the other man's palm. "Oh," he says exuberantly, "I see you have a very long lifeline, and you're going to have 3 children." He is excited and enthusiastic, and it's contagious. First, another man, and then another offers Desnos his hands. And again, the prediction is for longevity, children, and abundant joy. Human beings are capable of extreme beauty and extreme awfulness. The word awe encompasses both. We've had an awful series of incidents in our Wisconsin schools this week. In just this past week, there have been 8 threats of school shootings in Wisconsin, including an incident in Oshkosh and one in Waukesha where students who brought weapons to school were shot by police officers. Both of the students survived, and they didn't shoot any other students, but the experience was terrifying and awful. Waukesha is pretty close to home. We have members here who live in Waukesha, members who have family in Waukesha schools as teachers and students and administrators. We have members with family on the responding police force. This incident wasn't just news for many of the people who are sitting in this room today. This was a story about family. This was a story about home. And when you're talking about your neighbors or your cousin or wife or childhood friend, the experience of that story shifts a little bit. It can be easy to assume heroes and villains among people that we don't know, following a script that we've read before. But when we're talking about people we do know, a kid who was bullied, for instance, or a teacher who would have given his life to protect his students, or an officer who had joined the force because he wanted to help people. When we're talking about students we know, young people who lived through a lockdown at school and heard the words, "This is not a drill," then the feelings are more raw, more real, and maybe a little bit more complicated. Telling the story itself becomes complicated because every word carries the weight of someone we know, maybe even someone we love, someone to whom we are obligated, with whom we are in accountable relationship. So when we tell the story, do we say that the person who brought the guns to school was a student who was bullied? Does it matter if we say that the student was Black? When we tell the story, should we say that the guns were pellet guns? And then what if we also say that there's no way to tell the difference between a pellet gun and a real gun? Does it matter if we say that the shooting officer was white? What if we then say that the student pointed his pellet gun at the officer before he shot him? What happens if we say that the shooting officer is a friend of one of our members? Should we put our focus on telling the stories of people who responded in the moment to try to help and protect other students in that school? Should we focus on telling the story of what led up to the incident, what was happening at home or at school before this? Should we talk about where the guns came from? What about the histories of all the people that were involved? What about the systems and the policies and the training that formed the framework of all of those histories of people that lived them out together? There is awfulness and awesomeness and everything in between in this story and in all the tributaries of stories that fed into this story. In the Robert Desnos story, when he was standing in line to go to the gas chamber, the surrealist poet kept reading more and more palms, predicting long and joyful lives for every prisoner in line. Griffin writes again, as Desnos reads more palms, not only does the mood of the prisoners change, but that of the guards too. They became disoriented. In fact, they became so disoriented by this sudden change that they are unable to go through with the executions. So the guards put all of the men, along with Desnos, back onto the truck and drove them back to the barracks. No one went to the gas chamber that day, and Desnos was never executed. Human beings are capable of extreme awfulness and extreme awesomeness. Desnos was able to show a resilience and a creativity in the face of seemingly insurmountable horror. He told a story in wild opposition to reality. But in sharing that story and sharing his alternative vision of what was possible, that vision became powerful enough to transform the horror that was surrounding him. How can we be part of creating a vision of love and connection and hope that it is so powerful that it overwhelms the horror around us? Sometimes we tell stories in ways that dehumanize people. Sometimes we tell stories in ways that take complicated and multifaceted human beings and collapse them into flat character cutouts. I hope that this week we're learning that it's a little bit harder to do that when a story is close to home and you know the people. Universalism's theology holds that all people are sacred and inherently worthy, even in the midst of stories of suffering and harm. But just as we cannot collapse complex people into flat heroes and villains, nor can we collapse complex stories into a flat everybody matters and so it's all the same. Everyone does matter. But not everyone has had the same experience. Differences in our lives, including differences of power, affect how much we have been harmed, how we process that harm, and choices that we make about causing harm. Restorative justice processes seek to address harm in ways that are consistent with universalist theology as well as with the unique specifics of people's real lives. Restorative justice respects and honors the full humanity of everyone involved in an experience of harm, but it doesn't flatten that humanity into simple archetypes like hero and villain, good guy and bad guy. Rather, it invites people who have been involved in an experience of harm to tell their full stories and allows them to encounter one another as full people with their full range of feelings, while also addressing and acknowledging the fact that harm was caused. Restorative justice recognizes that relationships in a situation of harm go beyond offender and victim and include the entire community, that those relationships are part of what caused the situation and part of where the situation ripples out. It understands that none of us are isolated individuals, that we're all connected to one another and influence one another's lives. It's a framework that's been used in our criminal justice systems, in schools, and even in international relations after conflict or mass violence. It's an alternative to a punishment or retribution framework because the focus of restorative justice is on repairing the harm that was done rather than punishing someone for wrongdoings. Focusing on repairing harm that is done actually puts the victims of the harm at the center of the story and then asks them to say what their own needs are. It asks the victims of the harm to define what they need. But it also doesn't exclude the humanity of the persons or people who caused the harm. Instead, it asks those persons or people to be in accountable relationship with the people that they harmed, to listen to their story and learn what the impact of their actions were. Restorative justice asks fundamentally different questions than punitive justice. Instead of asking what laws have been broken and by who, and what punishment do they therefore deserve, restorative justice asks, who has been hurt? What are their needs? And whose obligation is it to respond to those needs? It also asks, why did this happen? What are the root causes of this pain? And who has a stake in this situation, and how should they be involved in helping repair it? It's more complex. You end up with a larger and more difficult puzzle to solve than what laws were broken by who and what punishment do they deserve, because you're now talking about a complicated and interdependent web of relationships that are affected by the situation and were part of creating it. It looks at the community basis of crime and harm and how the community can and should be involved in repair. We're in the middle of an epidemic of harm when it comes to gun violence. In 2018, more school-aged children were killed by gun homicide than members of the military and police officers combined. That's part of the context of our story here. That's part of where the shuddering fear and dread comes from. When the children heard, "This is not a drill," they knew what that meant. Also, race makes a difference in children's experience with gun violence. Black children and youth in the United States are 14 times more likely to be victims of gun homicide than white children or youth. This terrifying story that we're in the midst of gun violence in a Waukesha school and in 7 other Wisconsin schools this week is a story that's unfolded in our Black communities over and over. That's another part of the larger context of this story, of the tributaries that run into this river. Restorative justice asks these kind of larger questions, as well as questions about the specific harm that happened in an incident. And we can say that deep harm was done this week by the student who brought those 2 pellet guns into school in Waukesha and pointed them at a fellow student and police officers. And deep harm was done to that student who was shot. And moreover, deep harm has been done by the gun companies who have made guns so widely available that the specter of school shootings is the known story in our schools. It's a reality that our students and teachers and administrators and police departments know so well, that they have trained on it, know how to respond to it, and that was the imaginative bridge to terror that was crossed into our real lives this week. There are many students around the country who are just waiting for something like this to happen in their school. The knowledge of it is both surreal and it is so real for our kids. There are layers and layers and layers of harm here. Different pieces of context and larger stories and smaller stories that fit in those larger stories. And the layers of harm are what must be addressed in order for our community and the people within it to heal. Our theology links the inerrant worth of every human being into the interdependent web of all existence. It's a complex universalism that respects all people, but also recognizes the way that harm is distributed differently among them. And then it centers the folks who have been harmed the most. This universalism doesn't condemn people who have caused harm in this world, but it empowers victims to identify their own needs and then ask for those needs to be met. This is a wildly different frame than punitive justice, which usually just creates flat caricatures of people, stereotypes, and fear of the other, whoever the other is. The stories that we tell matter. How we talk about our fellow human beings matters. Robert Desnos started telling a story of hope that was so compelling that it overwhelmed Nazi guards on a death mission. Right now, we could choose to tell a story of retribution and punishment, of simple, flat heroes and villains, or we could imagine something wildly different, something more complicated, something where people get to be full, complicated humans. We could tell a story that recognizes the humanity of everyone involved and the long, complex histories and the bigger pictures that led to this moment of terror and awfulness. And we could choose to invoke the power of human connection to create a new vision of what's possible, a vision of repair and transformation and love. Restorative justice is one tool that could facilitate the kind of transformation that we need in our community. It's one tool that might help us encounter one another and learn each other's deep truths and complex lives. I hope that we will create the space for our community to examine the root causes of harm and to begin employing preventative medicine as well as repair. The ending of our story is not written yet. I hope that we might be part of dreaming an impossible dream of hope for the future. I hope that we will share this dream in a way that will connect us like a little string of lights for the holiday season, sharing it one to the next and becoming more powerful. Dreams of hope and connection in the face of awfulness, and repair and communal transformation in the darkness light up more and more people, and as they do, those dreams take root in our world. Will you hold your palms up for me, loved ones? I'd like to read your future. Let's see. I see repair of harm and prevention of future gun violence in our future. I see racial justice and reconciliation in our city's future. I see clean water and healthy air in our world. Oh, yes. And I see long and healthy lives for each and every one of you. May it be so.